The crown of England once gleamed with the promise of eternity. Under the Plantagenets it had shone from the time of Henry II through Edward III and into the glorious reign of Henry V. Yet by the middle of the 15th century, that radiance had dimmed. The same dynasty that had brought England triumph over France now found itself torn apart from within. Fields that once echoed with the cheers of victory were now trampled by Englishmen fighting their own kin. The name Plantagenet, once a symbol of strength, order, and divine right, had become a whisper of fear and exhaustion. For generations, the family had ruled with confidence, born of conquest. They had built laws that shaped the kingdom and cathedrals that touched the heavens. Edward III had dreamed of empire, and his son, the great Henry I, had made that dream real at Agincourt. His armies had crossed the Channel like a divine storm, and for a brief moment it seemed that England might rule both sides of the sea. But triumph carries a hidden cost. The wars that made kings also emptied coffers, and every victory drew more from the heart of the realm. When the 100 Years' War finally sputtered to an end, it left England drained, its nobles restless, its people disillusioned. The king who followed Henry I was not the man his father had been. Henry VI, gentle in spirit and weak in judgment, could not hold together a nation built on ambition and steel. While he prayed, others plotted. The nobility, long accustomed to wielding armies in the king's name, now turned them upon each other. In every shire, loyalties fractured. Neighbors took sides not for country, but for blood. Two families emerged as rivals, each believing it carried the truest claim to Edward III's legacy. On one side stood the Lancasters, descendants of John of Gaunt, whose branch had held the throne since Henry IV. On the other stood the Yorkists, descendants of Edmund of Langley and the elder line of Lionel of Antwerp, who believed the right to rule flowed more purely through their veins. It was not rebellion against the crown, but a struggle over who the crown truly belonged to. Across England, the air thickened with rumor and resentment. Great lords raised private armies, draped in colors that marked allegiance. The red rose for Lancaster, the white rose for York. In the beginning, it was said the conflict would be swift, a matter of succession resolved by chivalry and reason. But there was no reason left to guide the sword. The first clash at St. Albans in 1455 was only the beginning. From that moment, the kingdom descended into a cycle of vengeance that would last for decades. The fields of Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury would come to define an era where England bled itself into silence. Merchants closed their stalls, villages burned, and fathers buried sons whose names no one would remember. It was not a war fought for faith or foreign conquest, but for pride, legitimacy, and survival. Chroniclers wrote that the roses bloomed red and white that summer, though no one could tell which color belonged to victory. Through these years, the Plantagenet name began to lose its holiness. Kings rose and fell like waves against a crumbling shore. Henry VI had restored for a brief moment, soon gave way to Edward IV of York, whose charm and youth brought hope before dissolving into scandal and mistrust. The kingdom that had once stood tall under the banner of St. George now trembled under the weight of its own heritage. And yet, in the chaos, something deeper stirred. The English people began to see the frailty of their rulers, to question the sanctity of lineage that had once seemed ordained by heaven. A new generation born amid conflict would no longer measure loyalty by the crest of a rose, but by the promise of stability. As the 15th century waned, the Plantagenets had turned from conquerors into cautionary figures. Their empire of chivalry had become a house divided, haunted by its own brilliance. The scholars at Oxford wrote that England was a kingdom at war with its reflection. The clergy prayed for redemption, but no prayer could bridge a chasm dug by ambition. In the final years of the Wars of the Roses, the crown itself seemed cursed, passing from one hand to another, never resting long enough to gather peace. The people waited for something, or someone, to end the cycle. It would not come from a mighty general, nor from a line pure in blood, but from exile and endurance. Later historians would look back and say that England's greatest enemy had never been France or Scotland or any foreign power. It was pride. It was the arrogance of blood that believed itself immortal. And so the Plantagenets, who had built the mightiest dynasty in Europe, fell not by invasion, but by inheritance. The crown still glittered under the same sun that once shone at Agincourt, but now its light was colder. The roses that had divided a nation had withered, their colors fading into the soil, and from that soil something new would rise, a man of uncertain birth, a realm longing for peace, and a dynasty that would redefine what it meant to rule England. For history, like the seasons, never truly ends. It turns, renews, and begins again. The fall of the Plantagenets was not the end of England's story. It was the dawn before another dynasty claimed the morning. Stay with this story and listen closely, for from ruin a new England will be born. Richard, Duke of York, entered the story like a storm that had been waiting behind the clouds. He was not born a usurper, but shaped by the logic of his age. A nobleman who believed that birth and virtue could still restore a kingdom sinking into disorder. He was intelligent, proud, and impossibly sure of his place in the world. In a court ruled by factions, whispers, and weakness, Richard stood as the man who would bring reason back to the crown. Or so he believed. He traced his lineage not merely to the Plantagenets, but to two royal lines, one through Edmund of Langley, son of Edward III, and another through Lionel of Antwerp, the elder branch that gave his claim a sharper edge than that of the reigning house of Lancaster. To Richard, the kingdom's chaos was not just misfortune, it was a sign that divine order had been disturbed. Henry VI, with his gentle piety and fragile spirit, seemed less a monarch and more a symbol of how far England had fallen. And so, in private councils and public speeches alike, Richard began to imagine himself not as a rebel, but as a restorer. He was not without loyalty. For years he served faithfully as protector of the realm. When the king's mind faltered, he governed with diligence, curbing corruption, restoring discipline to the treasury, and punishing those who abused their influence. But power in England had never belonged solely to the capable. It belonged to those who could command both allegiance and fear. When Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, began gathering her own supporters to defend her son's right to succeed, Richard's authority became a threat to the throne itself. Court life grew poisonous. Letters dripped with suspicion. Alliances formed and crumbled overnight. The line between duty and ambition blurred until even Richard himself could no longer tell whether he fought for England or for his own destiny. The nation, weary from years of decline, began to look to him as a possible savior, and that belief, like a spark in dry wood, would soon ignite something no one could control. The first open clash came at St. Albans, where Richard's forces confronted the Lancastrian royal army. It was swift, decisive, and shocking, proof that the nobility would now decide by arms what could not be settled by words. Though Richard knelt afterward before the king in token submission, the illusion of peace had been shattered. England was now two nations in one body, and neither would yield. As the years passed, Richard's confidence hardened into certainty. He gathered allies, powerful men like the Earl of Warwick, later known as the Kingmaker, and spoke openly of his lineage and duty to claim what was rightfully his. The old customs of restraint fell away. Every triumph convinced him that Providence favored the House of York. Yet pride, even when born of purpose, has a way of leading men to their own undoing. In December 1460, Richard marched north to confront the Lancastrian host near Wakefield. It was winter, and the fields lay silent beneath the frost. He expected a formal engagement, a contest of honor between noble houses. Instead, what awaited him was the chaos of desperation. Margaret's supporters outnumbered his, and their resolve was fueled not by politics, but by vengeance and fear. Still, Richard advanced, trusting in discipline and his cause. When the sun set that day, England had lost one of its most formidable sons. The Duke of York fell on the same soil that had once sustained his ancestors' rise. His dream of restoring order had turned to dust, yet it would not die with him. His eldest son, Edward, would inherit both the ambition and the burden. Those who survived Wakefield said that even in defeat, Richard's name carried a strange power. To his followers, he was not a man undone by pride, but a martyr of destiny. A reminder that justice, once awakened, cannot easily be silenced. The banner of York was raised again, and from its shadow stepped a youth whose courage matched his father's will, but burned with a different kind of fire. Edward, tall, charismatic, and gifted with the charm that wins hearts where reason fails. In the months that followed, the war consumed the kingdom once more. The church, torn between loyalty and conscience, found itself divided. Some bishops prayed for Lancaster's preservation, others whispered Yorkist prayers behind closed doors. The monasteries that once stood as sanctuaries of peace became houses of fear, their bells tolling not for holy days, but for approaching armies. The people, weary of shifting kings and endless levies, spoke less of victory and more of survival. Markets grew quiet, roads turned unsafe. Even the seasons seemed uncertain, as if heaven itself hesitated to bless either rose. Chroniclers recorded not only the names of lords, but the silence of villages, the echo of empty harvest fields, the sound of a nation slowly wearing itself thin. And yet, amid the weariness, something unbreakable endured, the idea that England could still find balance, that one line might end the strife and bring peace once more. The fall of Richard of York was not the end of his vision, only its transformation. The torch had passed to Edward, his son, who would soon march under the White Rose toward a destiny both glorious and tragic. The realm, though bruised and divided, still waited for deliverance. But deliverance, as history often proves, never comes without cost. The story of England's renewal would be written not in triumph, but in the quiet persistence of those who refused to surrender hope. And in that resolve, born from Richard's fall, the future of a new monarchy began to stir. Edward of York rose like a flame, kindled from the ashes of his father's fall. Barely 19, tall, broad-shouldered, and unshakably confident, he seemed every inch the hero a fractured nation longed for. Where Richard of York had carried the gravitas of duty, Edward carried the electricity of destiny. His charisma drew men to him, his courage kept them there, and his victories, swift, brilliant, and relentless, made England believe that the age of turmoil might yet find its end under his banner. In the early spring of 1461, Edward faced the decisive test of his claim at the Battle of Towton. Snow and wind lashed the open plain as two armies confronted each other, each believing itself to fight for England's future. It was said that the day turned white not only from the storm, but from the sheer fury of battle. Contest that decided not merely kings, but generations. When it was over, Edward's flag, the White Rose of York, stood over the field. The victory was overwhelming. The Lancastrian cause, once carried by Henry VI and his queen, was broken. In a single day, the young Duke of York had become the undisputed King of England. The coronation of Edward IV was a spectacle of light and promise. Bells rang across London, tapestries hung from the windows of Guildhall, and people filled the streets shouting his name. He was young, radiant, and victorious, a king who embodied renewal after years of despair. Chroniclers wrote that never had England rejoiced so greatly, nor believed so deeply in her future. Yet beneath the pageantry, cracks had already begun to form. The new king possessed all the gifts of a conqueror, but not yet the restraint of a ruler. Edward loved splendor, ease, and above all, the thrill of choosing his own path. When he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a widowed commoner of beauty and wit, it stunned the nobility. She was neither of royal blood nor of great political advantage. To the court, it was a union of passion, not statecraft. And in a kingdom held together by fragile alliances, passion was a dangerous luxury. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man who had orchestrated Edward's rise and was hailed as the kingmaker, felt betrayed. He had arranged foreign matches to strengthen the crown's legitimacy, only to be cast aside by the impulsive marriage. In that single act, Edward fractured the foundation of trust between himself and the most powerful noble in the land. The alliance that had won him a throne began to turn into rivalry. Elizabeth Woodville's large family was swiftly elevated to positions of privilege. Her brothers and sisters filled the royal court, displacing the old nobility who had fought to put Edward on the throne. The older lords, proud, ambitious, and dangerous when slighted, saw in her influence a threat to their own power. The air of victory soured into suspicion. Whispers crept through the halls of Westminster that the king had exchanged the sword of conquest for the silks of pleasure. Warwick, once the architect of Edward's triumph, became his shadowed adversary. With growing resentment, he turned his political genius toward rebellion. In a stunning reversal, he allied himself with the very house he had once destroyed, the Lancastrians. Henry VI, long a captive and a relic of a bygone age, was briefly restored to the throne. The wheel of fortune, ever turning, seemed to mock the ambitions of all who sought to master it. But destiny, though it wavers, rarely forgets its chosen. Edward escaped capture, rallied loyalists, and returned from exile with a force that reignited the cause of York. At Barnet and Tewkesbury, his armies triumphed again, crushing both Warwick's rebellion and the last hopes of the Lancastrians. Warwick fell, his legend ending where his own cunning had turned against him. Henry VI, the ghost of the old dynasty, faded from history's stage soon after. Edward IV, restored to power, seemed untouchable. Yet the glory of his second reign was different, darker, quieter, and shadowed by the cost of what he had endured. He ruled with authority but also indulgence, surrounding himself with luxury and loyalists rather than reformers. The once heroic king grew heavier, more suspicious, less eager to lead in person. The white rose still bloomed, but its petals had begun to curl. The court glittered with opulence, but beneath the gold and velvet, corruption took root. Factions re-emerged, whispering behind painted walls. Old rivalries simmered among the nobles, while the common people murmured about taxes, favoritism, and the burdens of a king who seemed more enthralled by comfort than by duty. Edward's strength as a warrior had united England, but his weaknesses as a man threatened to divide it again. By the 1470s, the once mighty House of York had begun to consume itself. Edward's brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, eyed one another warily, each aware that power had become a dangerous inheritance. Clarence, charming yet unstable, courted conspiracy. Gloucester, quieter and calculating, kept his intentions hidden. The Plantagenet bloodline, once the foundation of England's greatness, had turned inward, devouring its own peace. Historians would later call Edward IV both savior and sinner, a king who gave England the illusion of calm yet planted the seeds of its next storm. He had won the throne through valor and charisma, but he ruled it through appetite and pride. The very gifts that had lifted him to greatness became the flaws that eroded his legacy. When Edward looked upon his court in his final years, he might have seen not a kingdom healed, but one merely catching its breath. The Wars of the Roses were not over, they were only waiting, and in the echo of his reign, the fragile glory of the Plantagenets trembled once more, foreshadowing the night that would soon descend upon the crown. For in England's story, every victory carries the shadow of its undoing, and Edward IV, the Golden King, would soon learn that triumph, too, can be a kind of downfall. The spring of 1483 arrived in London with a strange stillness. The streets, usually alive with noise and motion, seemed quieter, as if the very air held its breath. In the royal chambers of Westminster, King Edward IV, the once golden ruler who had won back England through charisma and might, lay weakened and fading. Years of excess had dulled his strength, but no one expected the end to come so suddenly. The man who had united the realm through force of will was now at the mercy of fate, surrounded not by cheering crowds or the thunder of armies, but by murmured prayers and the uneasy silence of courtiers who already wondered what would follow. When death came, it came swiftly. Edward IV, at 40, left, behind not a legacy of peace, but a question that would soon consume the kingdom. Who would truly rule England now? His eldest son, Prince Edward, was only 12 years old, bright and well-mannered, but still a child. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, was just 9. Two boys, symbols of hope and vulnerability, stood between the crown and the storm that was gathering. In those first uncertain days, the court spoke with hushed reverence about continuity and loyalty. Yet behind every expression of grief, there flickered calculation. Power abhors a vacuum, and in England, vacuums did not last long. The late king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, rode south from the Northlands, where he had long governed with reputation for discipline and fairness. Outwardly, he came as protector of his nephews, declaring devotion to the memory of Edward there into the rightful succession of young Prince Edward. But those who watched him closely sensed that beneath the calm exterior, something older than duty stirred, the call of destiny that had haunted every Plantagenet before him. Richard was a man of contrasts, austere yet courteous, loyal yet ambitious, careful yet capable of ruthless precision when he believed the cause was just. He had served his brother faithfully in life, and yet his mind was sharp enough to see what few dared to say aloud, that England, under a child king, was vulnerable. The court was divided, the nobles restless, and Queen Elizabeth Woodville's family, her ambitious brothers and sons from her first marriage, were despised by many who had once supported Edward IV. In the weeks following the king's death, letters moved faster than armies. Messages from the Queen's kin urged her to crown her son immediately to secure power before any rival could challenge it. But Richard, riding toward London with measured calm, sent his own messages to the peers of the realm, to men of influence, assuring them that he sought only stability, that he would safeguard the young king until his coronation. It was a promise that sounded noble. It was also one that would soon take on a far darker meaning. When Richard met the royal party at Stony Stratford, events took a decisive turn. The boy king, innocent and trusting, greeted his uncle warmly. The Queen's relatives, less naive, bristled at the presence of Gloucester's armed retinue. What happened next was the beginning of England's new descent into suspicion and intrigue. With quiet authority, Richard dismissed the Queen's men and assumed guardianship of the prince himself, citing his duty as Lord Protector. The boy would continue to London under his uncle's care. Queen Elizabeth, hearing the news, fled to Westminster Abbey, seeking sanctuary for herself and her younger son. To the people of London, it seemed a familiar story, power shifting again, this time behind polite words and solemn vows. The realm had not even buried one king before the seeds of another. Crisis began to sprout. The coronation of Prince Edward was scheduled for summer, but weeks passed, and no date was set. Richard now controlled the royal household, the council, and the boy. In the grand halls of Westminster, men whispered about his intentions. Some spoke of genuine concern, that Richard feared the manipulations of the Woodville faction and sought only to preserve order. Others, more cynical, murmured that the Duke of Gloucester had begun to see himself not as guardian, but as heir. Chroniclers later described this time as a season of shadows. Londoners gathered in taverns and marketplaces to trade rumors that the council was split, that secret meetings were held at night, that the young king would never be crowned. The once bright court of Edward IV had dimmed into a theater of distrust. Meanwhile, Richard moved with calculated grace. He addressed the nobles with modest words, invoking loyalty and faith. He ordered new proclamations declaring his duty to protect the realm from deceit. He even visited the boy king in public, speaking gently, ensuring that all could see his affection and care. But beneath this image of calm stewardship, he was weaving a careful web, one thread at a time. In June, the boy and his brother were moved to the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection until the coronation. It was a customary practice, yet the symbolism was inescapable. The Tower was both fortress and prison, both seat of power and silent warning. Those who remembered history knew that once the crown entered its gates, not all who wore it ever emerged again. Across England, the mood grew tense. The merchants spoke in cautious tones, the nobles in guarded words. In the cathedrals, priests prayed for peace, though even the prayers sounded uncertain. The nation, tired of war, now watched a quieter conflict unfold. One fought not with swords, but with secrets. Richard of Gloucester stood at the heart of it all, calm, inscrutable, unreadable. To some, he was the last true Plantagenet knight, loyal to the end. To others, he was a man who saw the throne as both burden and destiny, and who would not let it slip from his grasp. When night fell over London, the bells no longer rang with celebration. The kingdom waited breathless for what would come next. And in the stillness, one truth hung heavy in the air. Peace in England was always only the pause between storms. Richard of Gloucester's rise to the throne was not the sudden strike of a usurper, but the slow tightening of circumstance and ambition. In the weeks that followed the death of his brother, the lines between loyalty and necessity blurred until they became indistinguishable. What had begun as guardianship evolved into authority, and authority, once tasted, rarely retreats willingly. By midsummer of 1483, Richard held the powers of regent in all but name. The council deferred to him, the armies obeyed him, and the boy King Edward, barely 12, was confined within the thick walls of the Tower of London for his own safety. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, soon joined him. To the people, it was explained as tradition. Before coronation, kings always lodged in the Tower, but even in the streets, whispers grew louder. Why were the gates locked so tightly? And why did so few see the princes thereafter? In June, Parliament was summoned, and rumors began to move faster than decrees. There were murmurs that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that the princes were illegitimate, that the rightful heir was none other than their uncle Richard. No one knew who first spoke the words, but once spoken, they carried their own power. Legitimacy, after all, is as fragile as the paper that declares it. And so, on a gray July morning, the Duke of Gloucester was proclaimed King Richard III. The ceremony was grand, yet strangely subdued. Choirs sang in Westminster Abbey, the golden canopy glimmered, and the crown, once worn by Edward the Conqueror and Henry the Saint, was lowered upon Richard's head. To those who watched, he appeared calm, composed, almost reluctant, as though burdened by duty rather than inflamed by desire. But even as the cheers echoed through the nave, a chill settled over London. The two princes whose right to rule had been displaced were not present, nor would they ever be seen again. Their disappearance became one of the great enigmas of English history. No body was displayed, no message proclaimed, no confession recorded. They simply vanished into the silence of the Tower. The city murmured, first in curiosity, then in fear. Chroniclers later wrote that the night around the fortress grew quieter than it had ever been before, as if even the stones were keeping a secret. To his supporters, Richard remained the image of resolve. He introduced reforms to make the law fairer, curbed corruption in the courts, and ensured that petitions from the poor could reach the crown. His governance was not that of a tyrant, but of a man who believed, perhaps sincerely, that he could restore the justice his family's wars had destroyed. Yet the shadow of the missing princes lengthened across every good deed. It followed him from council chambers to chapels, whispered behind him in the corridors of power. The people could not forget the question, where were the sons of Edward the Warrior? Richard's reign, brief as it was, unfolded like a staged tragedy, filled with grandeur and unease. He ruled with intelligence and precision, but his presence seemed haunted. Those who met him described a man torn between iron conviction and a private torment. He never confessed. He prayed often, gave alms, and commissioned churches as if searching for absolution that the world refused to grant. In the months that followed, the machinery of rumor became unstoppable. The Woodville family, now in exile and allied with Henry Tudor across the sea, began spreading stories that painted Richard as a monster, a usurper who had seized the crown through treachery and violence. Poets and preachers took up the narrative, turning suspicion into legend. The tale of the princes in the Tower became a moral parable, a warning of ambition's cost, of power purchased at too high a price. But history, like memory, is written by the victors, and the victors were not kind. When the Tudors came to power 2 years later, they sealed Richard's fate not just in battle, but in story. Under Henry VII, and later through the pen of Shakespeare, Richard III became a creature of darkness, crooked in body, twisted in soul, a villain shaped for the stage. His motives were reduced to greed, his deeds to betrayal, his humanity erased. And yet, beyond the myth, the man remains elusive. Some records portray him as a ruler of integrity, loyal to justice, even merciful to former foes. Others insist he orchestrated the disappearance of his nephews to secure the crown. Between these extremes lies the truth, somewhere half buried, like the bones that would centuries later be found beneath a car park in Leicester, long after his name had turned to legend. In the eyes of his contemporaries, Richard was both king and contradiction, devout yet ruthless, loyal yet self-serving, tragic yet resolute. He embodied the fatal tension that had haunted the Plantagenets for generations, the belief that power could be righteous if only one's cause was pure enough. But power, in England's long story, has never been pure. As the months passed, omens seemed to gather. Storms lashed the coast, crops failed, and preachers spoke of divine judgment. The court grew restless, its nobles divided between fear and fatigue. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor prepared his claim, his ships waiting for the wind that would carry him toward destiny. Richard, alone amid his grandeur, must have sensed that the walls were closing in. He had claimed the throne to protect the realm, yet found himself more isolated than any king before him. The crown upon his head gleamed with authority, but it weighed like a chain. In the end, the question that history asks of Richard III is not merely whether he was guilty, but whether he was ever free. Free from the expectations of blood, from the curses of family, from the relentless gravity of the crown. For in England, the throne was never just a seat of power. It was a mirror that revealed the soul of the one who dared to sit upon it. And Richard, both king and captive, could not escape what that mirror showed. England, in the years that followed Richard III's coronation, was a kingdom without conviction, a land caught between memory and exhaustion. The civil wars that had once been fought for honor and lineage had left behind a hollow echo, a fatigue that ran deeper than the soil itself. The roses that had symbolized rival houses now seemed faded, their colors indistinguishable beneath the gray skies of a weary nation. Victory had brought no peace. It had only rearranged the ruins. Among the nobility, loyalty had become a currency that few could afford. Those who had sworn allegiance to one king now bowed to another, not from faith, but from fear of falling. Great houses, once proud pillars of chivalric order, turned inward, guarding their estates, counting their dwindling coffers. The line between ally and rival blurred into convenience. Letters once sealed with oaths of fealty now carried polite betrayals, written in the elegant language of survival. For the common people, the consequences were crueler still. The wars had drained men from the fields, leaving harvests thin and hands idle. Famine spread quietly, not as a single catastrophe, but as a slow erosion of stability. Grain prices rose, trade faltered, and villages, once vibrant with laughter and bells, fell silent. Peasants, who had once marched proudly under banners of their lords, now returned home to find their roofs caved in and their faith tested. In towns, guilds disbanded, apprentices wandered in search of work, and the marketplace, once the pulse of civic life, became a shadow of itself. The clergy, too, stood divided. Bishops, once thundering voices of conscience, grew cautious, fearful of offending whichever power held the crown this month or the next. In the great cathedrals of York and Canterbury, candles still burned, but the sermons had lost their fire. The church, which had once stood as the moral anchor of England, now seemed adrift, unwilling to condemn, unable to inspire. To speak truth in such times was to risk disappearance, and so silence became the holiest virtue. And yet, amid that silence, the moral decay of politics thrived. Richard's government, though orderly on the surface, was built on fragile foundations of mistrust. The council halls smelled not of incense and oak, but of calculation. Each noble sought to interpret the king's words as both promise and warning. Even those who served Richard with sincerity could feel the air thick with suspicion. The memory of vanished princes lingered like an unspoken prayer, and every decision was haunted by it. Across England, the economy withered. Years of internal conflict had crippled trade with Europe. Wool, the kingdom's lifeblood, lay unsold in warehouses. Merchants complained that ships no longer left the ports of Bristol or Southampton with the same vigor. The roads were dangerous, patrolled by men who once called themselves knights, but now lived by toll and theft. Disease spread through malnutrition and neglect, striking the weak and poor first, but sparing no one for long. London, still the heart of the realm, stank of waste and despair. Chroniclers wrote that the city seemed to breathe uneasily, as though the stones themselves were weary of keeping secrets. In the north, old feuds reignited. In the south, coastal towns prayed for trade winds that never came. The nation had become a body with no pulse, alive, yet not living. Amid this, decay. Scholars and chroniclers began to write in tones of mourning rather than praise. They spoke not of kings or battles, but of the corrosion of belief itself. One anonymous writer, likely a monk from York, penned the words that would come to define the age. When the throne is seized by iron and not by faith, there is no longer room for trust. It was both prophecy and epitaph, a lament for a kingdom that had forgotten the difference between conquest and justice. The phrase spread quickly among educated circles, copied in margins of manuscripts, whispered in universities, and repeated by priests who dared not name names. It captured the soul of a people who had grown weary of crowns that demanded loyalty but gave none in return. The Plantagenet dream of divine kingship, the belief that God chose rulers to embody moral order, was dying. What remained was politics stripped of sanctity, power reduced to possession. Even Richard, for all his resolve, could not escape the gravity of this moral collapse. He ruled from the throne, but he no longer ruled hearts. His reforms brought brief order, but no healing. Taxes rose to rebuild what wars had destroyed, and every new levy reminded the people that peace, too, carried a price. Behind the banners and ceremonies, England's soul trembled on the edge of despair. In the countryside, folk songs turned mournful. Ballads once sung about valor, now told of loss, of kings who forgot their people, of lords who vanished into self-interest, of families scattered by the whims of politics. Farmers prayed not for victory, but for a harvest that would last through winter. The wind carried fewer church bells and more sighs, and in London the scholars watched the weather change, both the skies and the tempers of men. The city had learned to live with uncertainty, to wear patience like armor. It was a kingdom waiting for something, perhaps redemption, perhaps reckoning. Through it all, Richard moved like a man out of time. His rule was one of precision, his governance meticulous, yet it could not disguise the emptiness beneath. He issued decrees, restored order, punished corruption, but what England needed was not law, it was faith, and that he could not command. For faith, once broken, cannot be restored by statute. By 1484, the country's exhaustion had hardened into cynicism. The nobles no longer dreamed of glory, they dreamed of survival. The church prayed without conviction, the peasants worked without hope, the scholars wrote without comfort, and above them all sat a king who could not silence the ghosts that whispered his name. England, once the envy of Christendom, had become a mirror of its own contradictions, strong in body, sick in spirit. The wars had ended, but the peace that followed felt like the stillness of a battlefield after the dust had settled, not calm, but emptiness. The chroniclers of that age did not end their accounts with triumph or praise. Instead, they wrote as though closing the final chapter of a long lament. The realm endures, one monk noted, but the heart of England sleeps. And thus, as the decade waned, the kingdom waited for a new dawn, uncertain whether it would bring light or judgment. For history, as England had learned too often, does not rest. It only turns the page and waits for the next hand to write. Far from the gray towers of London and the weary heart of England, another story was quietly taking shape, one that began not in triumph, but in exile. In the damp air of Brittany, among the monasteries and cobbled streets that faced the restless sea, a young man named Henry Tudor grew into adulthood beneath the shadow of a crown he had never seen. He was an heir in name only, an echo of a dynasty that had long been scattered by defeat. Yet in that echo, the faint pulse of destiny still beat. Henry's claim to the throne was fragile, almost absurdly so. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, he descended from John of Gaunt, the great son of Edward III, but through a line long tarnished by illegitimacy. His father, Edmund Tudor, had been half Welsh, half English, a man of minor standing, whose only true inheritance was loyalty. From that union came Henry, born in Pembroke Castle in 1457, while England tore itself apart. Before he could speak, his father was dead. Before he could walk, his life was already a question of survival. When the tides of war turned against the House of Lancaster, Henry's world narrowed to a handful of loyal protectors and the steady faith of his mother. Margaret Beaufort was no ordinary woman. Barely 13 when she bore him, she possessed a conviction that far exceeded her years. To her, Henry was not simply her son, he was God's instrument, chosen to heal the divisions of England. While others placed faith in armies, she placed hers in providence. Her letters to Henry, written in a careful hand that never trembled, became his compass. They spoke of patience, of destiny, and of endurance, the virtues of one who must wait for his hour. It was from her that Henry learned to believe that delay was not denial. "You are meant for more," she would remind him, "and the Lord will show you when." Through the shifting fortunes of England's wars, Henry became both fugitive and symbol. As York and Lancaster clashed, he fled first to Wales, then to France, and finally to the Duchy of Brittany. There, among foreign courts, he grew from frightened boy to measured man. The Breton air hardened him, the uncertainty of exile taught him silence, and silence, in turn, taught him wisdom. He lived modestly under the watchful eyes of those who alternately protected and bargained over him. To the Duke of Brittany, Henry was both guest and pawn, a card to be played against England when the winds of politics changed. The young exile learned early that survival was not only a matter of courage, but of restraint. He spoke little, observed much, and waited, always waited. Those who met him in exile described a man calm beyond his years. His gaze, they said, was steady but unreadable. He did not command with force, but with quiet conviction, the kind that drew men toward him without knowing why. Perhaps it was because he seemed untainted by the blood and pride that had ruined others. While Yorkists and Lancastrians alike had drowned themselves in vengeance, Henry carried himself like a man who had already counted the cost of war and refused to pay it twice. The years in Brittany were neither glorious nor comfortable. Henry's small retinue lived on uncertain funds, sometimes at the mercy of foreign favor. Yet through those long gray seasons, the idea of his return grew from faint rumor to sacred purpose. Every winter storm that lashed the coast seemed to whisper of England's need. Every letter from home, smuggled through cautious hands, carried news of unrest, nobles turning restless, Richard III's rule casting longer shadows. Margaret Beaufort, ever watchful in England, kept the flame alive. Though officially under the eye of the king, she built a web of alliances in silence. She reached out to disillusioned Yorkists, to courtiers weary of bloodshed, to bishops who still believed in divine restoration. Each correspondence was a thread in a tapestry of hope that stretched across the channel, binding mother and son. Henry, for his part, moved like a man who understood that destiny required preparation. He studied the histories of England, not the triumphs, but the mistakes. He learned the language of diplomacy and the art of patience, the kind that makes power seem inevitable. In the small court of Brittany, where he was neither prince nor prisoner, he began to form his own circle. Loyal men who believed that England could yet be healed under a crown untainted by old vengeance. At night, when the sea winds howled outside his chamber, Henry would sometimes stand by the narrow window and imagine the land he had never truly known. He saw not the splendor of Westminster or the gold of coronations, but the green hills of a country that had forgotten what peace looked like. In his mind, the throne was not a prize but a burden, a chance to bring balance to a nation that had long lived without it. And so, the years passed, and the boy of Pembroke grew into the man of destiny. His face became lean, his eyes thoughtful, his words deliberate. Beneath the calm surface, his mother's faith had become his own, quiet, steady, and unshakable. He had no army, no crown, no certainty, but he had purpose. While Richard III ruled across the sea with suspicion and ceremony, Henry Tudor waited. He waited through winters of exile and summers of longing, through doubt and temptation, through the fragile silence between history's breaths. When the time would come, he did not know, but he believed it would come. For Margaret had taught him a truth that would guide his life, that sometimes God hides kings not to forsake them, but to prepare them. And in that hidden season of exile, the next chapter of England's story was quietly gathering strength, waiting for its moment to return. While Henry Tudor waited in the shadows of exile, the cracks in Richard III's kingdom widened like fractures in old stone. The crown that Richard had seized to bring stability had instead become the weight that drew the realm toward collapse. Nobles who once pledged loyalty began to waver, Courtiers who once cheered his coronation now whispered behind closed doors. England had seen too many kings rise and fall to mistake silence for peace. By 1484, the uneasy calm of Richard's reign had curdled into suspicion. His legitimacy remained clouded by the mystery of the princes in the Tower, and no proclamation or parade could wash that stain away. Even those who admired his strength could not ignore the fear that surrounded him. A monarch who could not trust his court, they reasoned, would soon find his court unwilling to trust him. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor watched and listened. Messengers from England began to arrive in secret. Envoys, priests, and exiled nobles carrying words too dangerous to speak openly. They came not to pledge allegiance to Henry's lineage. Few truly believed in the right of a distant Lancastrian heir, but to place their hope in something rarer, reconciliation. It began as a whisper of strategy and ended as a whisper of destiny. If Henry were to marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, he could unite the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. Two warring branches of one royal tree finally intertwined. It was a plan that carried both political genius and poetic power. Elizabeth, then in her late teens, lived under the careful watch of Richard's court. She was known to be gracious, intelligent, and admired even by those who distrusted her bloodline. To the weary nation, her beauty seemed to symbolize the England that might yet be redeemed, soft-spoken, proud, but scarred by years of strife. A marriage between her and Henry promised not just stability, but healing. For Henry, the proposal was both opportunity and test. He knew he could not win England with soldiers alone. He would need something stronger than conquest. He would need to embody peace itself. The union with Elizabeth would make that possible. It would tell the people that the War of Roses was over, that neither side had triumphed or fallen, but both had survived through their children. Margaret Beaufort, ever the architect behind the scenes, understood its brilliance immediately. Her letters to Henry became more urgent, outlining the network of support growing around him. She had reached out to Thomas Stanley, her husband, and one of the most powerful lords in England, and to John Morton, Bishop of Ely, a shrewd strategist hiding his defiance beneath priestly calm. They, in turn, reached out to disillusioned Yorkists who could no longer bear the chill of Richard's rule. The plan that formed in these hidden correspondences was simple but audacious. Henry would land in England, claim the throne in the name of justice and reconciliation, and upon victory, wed Elizabeth of York. The roses, white and red, would finally bloom together on one stem. In exile, Henry read these letters by candlelight. They carried not just instructions, but emotion, the quiet hum of history turning. He understood the symbolism that others whispered about. If he could unite the two houses, he would not merely seize power, he would close the wound that had bled England for a generation. He spoke little of his feelings, as always, but those close to him noticed a change. He moved with renewed purpose, his resolve no longer that of a fugitive, but of a man chosen by circumstance and faith. To his closest companion, Jasper Tudor, he said one night, "If I must wear a crown, let it be to end this quarrel, not to continue it." In Brittany, Henry began to assemble a modest force, not an army of conquest, but of conviction. Knights and mercenaries, Welshmen and English exiles, bound by a shared dream of redemption. Among them were those who had lost sons in battle, those who had lost lands to treachery, and those who simply longed to believe that peace was still possible. Meanwhile, in England, Elizabeth of York became the quiet symbol of what could be. She appeared at court in solemn dignity, saying little, but her presence alone stirred speculation. Even Richard could not completely silence the talk. Some whispered that he considered marrying her himself to strengthen his claim. Though whether such thoughts were true or merely political rumor, history never settled. What mattered was that the idea of her union with someone, anyone, had become a question of England's future. As winter deepened and the seas grew restless, Henry's moment drew near. His supporters gathered in secret, binding their loyalty with prayers rather than oaths. They spoke of destiny, of divine providence, of a coming dawn after a generation of twilight. To them, Henry's return would not be a conquest. It would be a restoration of balance. On the eve of his departure, Henry stood again before the sea that had both sheltered and confined him. The wind cut cold against his face, carrying the scent of salt and fate. In the distance, ships rocked against their moorings, sails folded like wings waiting for command. He thought of his mother's words, of the letters written in trembling hope, of the promise he had made, to fight not for revenge, but for reconciliation. Far away in England, Elizabeth of York knelt in prayer, unaware that her name had become the cornerstone of a nation's future. 2 lives, 2 bloodlines, 2 destinies, one bound by duty, the other by faith, were drawing closer with each passing tide. When history remembers them, it speaks of crowns and dynasties, of politics and power. But in truth, their story was something deeper. It was the weary heartbeat of a nation learning, after decades of division, to dream again. And in that dream, beneath the storm and across the sea, the red and white roses waited, ready at last to bloom as one. The summer of 1485 came shrouded in mist. Along the gray shores of Harfleur, a fleet of modest ships waited, creaking, restless, like the hearts of the men who would sail upon them. Henry Tudor stood at the water's edge, his cloak heavy with morning dew, watching the tide move in slow rhythm beneath a sky that promised both peril and redemption. It had been 14 years since he had last seen England, 14 years since exile had turned him from a frightened boy into a patient man. Now at last, destiny called him home. Around him his small army moved quietly, some in prayer, some sharpening swords dulled by waiting. They were an unlikely force. Welshmen, Breton sailors, French mercenaries, and English exiles who had traded comfort for a chance at restoration. To most of them, the venture felt fragile, almost impossible. Richard III's armies numbered in the thousands, their loyalty bought with gold and fear. Henry's fleet carried fewer than 2,000 men and more hope than armor, yet among them stirred something stronger than numbers, the belief that England's soul still waited to be redeemed. At dawn, Henry gave the signal to embark. The sails rose like pale wings, catching the wind from the channel. The ships lurched forward, cutting through waves that gleamed silver in the mist. But the sea was fickle, as if testing their resolve. Storm clouds gathered before noon, and the wind turned fierce. The fleet scattered, each vessel fighting its own battle against the raging waters. Thunder rolled like distant drums of war, and lightning split the horizon with the fury of an unseen hand. Henry stood firm on the deck, rain stinging his face, his eyes fixed on the east, the direction of home. In the roar of the storm he thought of his mother's voice, calm and steady, echoing from memory. The Lord hides his chosen, not to abandon them, but to prepare them. Those words became his anchor as the ship heaved and shuddered. Men cried out, ropes snapped, and salt sprayed across their faces, but Henry's gaze did not waver. In that chaos he found an odd serenity. If this was the sea's judgment, then so be it. Destiny was worth the storm. After 2 days of violent weather, the fleet emerged battered but intact. The storm behind them, like a curse, exhaled. They sighted the coast of Wales, wild, green, and mist-wrapped, the land of Henry's birth. The cliffs rose from the sea like sentinels, silent and watchful. When they landed at Milford Haven, the men fell to their knees, kissing the earth. For Henry, the air smelled of both memory and promise. The land seemed to recognize him, though it had forgotten his name. But the return was not greeted with celebration. The Welsh lords who had once served his family were cautious, uncertain whether to trust a long-exiled claimant against a sitting king. Messages were sent and met with silence. Days passed without reinforcements. Some of Henry's followers began to whisper doubts about Richard's spies, about betrayal, about divine favor that might never come. In those uncertain nights, the campfires burned low, and fear crept in like fog. Henry walked among his men, listening rather than speaking. He saw the doubt in their faces, the fatigue in their movements. Yet beneath it all, he sensed the same hunger that had driven him for years, the longing to believe that England could be whole again. On the 7th evening, Henry gathered his soldiers in a clearing surrounded by mist. The air was cold, the moon veiled, and the forest seemed to lean closer to listen. He stood before them not as a prince, but as a man who had endured waiting, exile, and fear. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but unyielding. "My friends," he began, "you have crossed a sea with me not for gold, nor for vengeance, but for something far greater. We fight not for a throne of stone, but for the soul of a kingdom that has forgotten its heart. For too long, England has been ruled by suspicion and silence. Too long have brothers turned against brothers, and truth been buried beneath crowns. We do not march to conquer, we march to heal. The men listened, their eyes reflecting the dim firelight. Henry continued, his tone deepening with conviction. If we fall, let it be known that we fought not for ourselves, but for those who cannot fight, for the farmers who till empty fields, for the widows who still wait for sons who will never return, for the children who deserve a land unbroken by fear. We fight so that England may remember what it means to believe. A stillness followed, heavy and sacred. Then slowly the men began to raise their weapons, not in fury, but in quiet pledge. The sound of steel against the night was like a hymn. From that moment, despair loosened its hold. The next morning, they marched inland, through valleys veiled in mist and rain. Each mile drew new followers, Welsh lords, old soldiers, even villagers who left their plows to join the cause. Word spread like wind. Henry Tudor has returned, and with every step, the dream grew heavier, yet closer. Henry rode at the front, silent, his cloak dark with dew. Behind him trailed the red banners of Lancaster, fluttering beside the white standards of York, carried by those who believed in unity. The two colors, once symbols of hatred, now danced together in the Welsh wind. As they advanced toward destiny, Henry looked once more to the horizon. The mist was lifting. The hills ahead glowed faintly under a reluctant sun, as if the land itself were waking. And somewhere beyond that light, the crown waited, not as a prize of war, but as the final test of whether a nation's heart could still be mended. Dawn broke over the fields of Bosworth like a secret the earth had kept too long. The mist hung low, veiling the horizon in a pale shimmer, as if the land itself hesitated to reveal what history would demand of it that day. It was August 22nd of 1485, a date that no one present would forget, though few understood in that moment that the age of the Plantagenets was ending, and something new, fragile, and uncertain was about to begin. The battlefield stretched wide and uneven, rippling with damp grass and shallow pools of fog. On one side stood King Richard III, mounted on a white destrier that gleamed ghost-like in the early light. His armor was polished to a mirror's shine, his banner fluttering with the symbol of the white boar, emblem of defiance and personal pride. Around him, his army of thousands waited in disciplined silence, their formation a testament to years of command. Trumpets blared, low and deliberate, echoing across the plain like the heartbeat of a dying era. Richard sat tall in the saddle, every inch the image of a warrior king. His reign had been short, but his will remained ironclad. To him, this was not merely battle, it was judgment. The crown he wore had been hard won and harder kept, and he would not surrender it to a man he saw as a pretender born in exile. His eyes, sharp beneath the rim of his helm, swept the distant haze where Henry Tudor's forces gathered. "They come with borrowed courage," he murmured to his captains, "but they will learn whose hand still rules England." Across the misted field, Henry Tudor's army prepared with quieter resolve. Their banners were simple, red cloth bearing the faint outline of a rose, the color of dawn and faith. His men were fewer, their armor mismatched, their ranks thin compared to the glittering mass across the valley. But where Richard's camp bristled with command, Henry's breathed conviction. He rode among them not as a king, but as a man who had already endured loss and exile, speaking to each group in calm, measured tones. "Hold the line," he told them. "Remember why we stand. Today, we do not fight for a throne alone. We fight for England's soul." The words spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Men who had once fought each other now stood shoulder to shoulder, Yorkist and Lancastrian united by exhaustion and fragile hope. For the first time in a generation, the two roses were side by side, not as enemies, but as one. As the morning light grew, the battlefield seemed to breathe. The mist began to lift, revealing the full scale of the confrontation. On the hill of Ambion, Richard's artillery stood ready. Black cannons lined like watchful eyes. Below, archers set their arrows, and the first thrum of drums began. A low, steady rhythm, ancient and ominous. Henry's men, stationed across the marshy plain, raised their standards. The red rose of Lancaster fluttered beside the white rose of York, stitched together in a single emblem, a symbol of what might yet come if they survived the day. The banners caught the wind, their colors bleeding into one another in the haze, and for a moment it seemed as though England herself was holding her breath. Trumpets sounded from Richard's flank, sharp and commanding. The royal army began to advance, a wave of steel and purpose. The earth trembled beneath the march. Drums answered on Henry's side, not as loud, but filled with heartbeat rhythm, human, resolute. Between the two forces lay the marshes, damp and uncertain, a no-man's land where the first cries of war would soon echo. From his vantage point, Henry watched the advancing tide of Richard's forces. He turned to his uncle, Jasper Tudor, and spoke softly. "It begins, then, the end of an age?" Jasper nodded, his face solemn. "Aye," he said, "and the birth of another." Richard spurred his horse forward, his voice cutting through the noise like steel. "Forward!" he cried, "for crown and kingdom!" His soldiers roared in answer, banners surging, sunlight glinting off their spears. For a moment, the field seemed alive with movement, a living mosaic of color and conviction, gold and scarlet and silver beneath a gray sky. Henry rode along his front lines, his cloak brushing the spears of his men. "If you must remember anything," he said, "remember this. The crown means nothing if it costs us our conscience. Stand for one another, and England will stand again." The first clash of the two armies came not with fury, but with inevitability. The sound of metal meeting metal rippled across the plain like thunder chasing lightning. Arrows hissed through the air, banners dipped and swayed, and the mist began to scatter under the heat of movement. The battle had begun, not merely for a throne, but for the direction of a nation's heart. From the high ridge, the Stanley forces watched, silent, unmoving. They had yet to choose a side, waiting to see which way fortune would turn. Both kings looked to them, each knowing that the decision of one family could alter the fate of England itself. The sky darkened briefly as clouds swept overhead. The field below blurred into motion, lines breaking, merging, reforming. Through the chaos, Henry could be seen riding steadily, calm amid the storm, his banner still upright in the shifting light. Across from him, Richard moved like a blade through smoke, fierce and unrelenting, his commands echoing across the din. And all the while, the wind carried the mingled symbols of red and white, the roses of England fluttering above the turmoil like fragile prayers. By noon, the mist had fully lifted. The sun, pale and uncertain, cast its light across Bosworth Field, illuminating two men whose destinies had drawn them here from opposite ends of fortune. One fought to preserve his crown, the other to redeem his country. In that brief silence before the next charge, it seemed as though even the earth was listening, waiting to see which vision of England would emerge from the smoke. The battle at Bosworth swelled into a storm of motion and sound, trumpets blaring, banners snapping, and the steady rhythm of drums beating like the heart of destiny itself. The ground, wet from the morning mist, was now churned by hooves and boots, by the weight of men fighting not merely for victory, but for a version of England that could survive the morning. From the ridge above, Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother, Sir William Stanley, watched in silence. Their troops stood still, thousands of men waiting for a command that had not yet come. Both Richard and Henry had counted on their loyalty, but the Stanleys were masters of survival, not sentiment. To move too soon meant ruin. To move too late meant irrelevance. And so they waited, poised on the knife's edge of history, knowing that when they finally chose, the kingdom itself would tilt with them. Richard noticed their hesitation. Through the chaos below, his sharp eyes caught the banners of the Stanleys, motionless against the wind. His temper flared beneath the weight of his armor. "They linger like vultures," he shouted to his captains. "If they will not fight for their king, they shall fall with his enemies." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. England's loyalty had become as thin as its peace. Across the field, Henry Tudor rode with a small company, his banner fluttering red and white. His army fought bravely but was being pressed hard by Richard's superior numbers. The royal troops, disciplined and relentless, advanced inch by inch, driving Henry's men toward the marshy lowland. Jasper Tudor urged his nephew to fall back, to find safer ground, But Henry, calm amid the thunder of war, shook his head. "No," he said softly. "If I retreat now, England retreats with me." It was then that Richard saw him, a glint of red and gold amid the fog, a figure riding slightly apart from the main force. A chance, fleeting yet electric, sparked in Richard's mind. If he could strike directly at Henry and end the rebellion with his own hand, the day would be his. The crown would be secured not by counsel or chance, but by courage. He spurred his horse forward, breaking from his guards. "To me," he called, "to me, loyal hearts." And with a surge of speed, Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, charged downhill into the storm. The white boar standard followed him, flashing in the sunlight like a comet about to burn out. His assault cut straight through the lines. Men scattered as he rode past, his determination like fire made flesh. Even his enemies could not help but feel awe. This was no cowardly monarch clinging to the throne, but a soldier who would wager his life for his crown. The ground trembled beneath his charge as he cut through the vanguard and bore down on Henry's small retinue. Henry saw him coming. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to slow. The mist, the drums, the cries, fading into silence. Jasper shouted for Henry to fall back, but the younger man did not move. "Hold the line," he commanded, though his voice trembled with the weight of what was coming. Richard's attack crashed into Henry's guard. Swords flashed, shouts echoed through the haze, the air alive with the clang of armor and the clash of will. The king fought like a man possessed, driven by something larger than rage, something closer to destiny's refusal. He cut a path toward Henry, his breath sharp, his movements exact. And then came the moment that changed history. From the ridge, Sir William Stanley saw the king's white banner plunge deep into the chaos, its bearers dwindling as they pressed toward Henry's line. He turned to his men, his voice calm but decisive. "There," he said, pointing toward the struggling knot of riders, "there rides the end of tyranny and the beginning of England's peace." His army began to move. The stillness broke like a dam giving way. Thousands of Stanley soldiers surged downhill, their armor glinting under the pale sun, their banners unfurling in a tide of color. Richard looked up just as the sound reached him, the thunder of hooves, the roar of men not coming to his aid, but against him. For the first time that day, the king's certainty wavered. His captain shouted for him to withdraw, to rally his troops. But Richard refused. "No retreat," he cried. "I was born for this field." The circle closed around him. His horse stumbled in the churned earth, its flanks heaving. For an instant the king stood alone, armor streaked with dust, breath ragged, crown glinting faintly in the murk. The battle raged around him, faceless and endless. Yet in that small circle, time seemed to pause. Witnesses would later swear that they heard him cry out, defiant, bitter, and immortal, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." But no horse came. Only the tide of fate closing in. When the noise faded and the sun climbed higher, the field of Bosworth lay still. The banners of Richard's army drooped in silence. The white boar standard had fallen. Through the haze, Henry Tudor dismounted, his expression solemn, almost mournful. Around him, the surviving captains of both houses looked on in silence as Lord Stanley approached, something gleaming in his hand. He knelt briefly, holding it up for all to see. It was the crown, bent, tarnished, yet unmistakable. Stanley rose and placed it upon Henry's head. "God save the king, Henry VII," he said. The words rippled through the ranks, first a whisper, then a wave, until the valley itself seemed to speak them. Henry stood still, the crown resting lightly upon him, the wind stirring his cloak. In that moment, the red rose and the white finally met, not as rivals, but as one emblem of renewal. Far above, the clouds began to break. Sunlight spilled across the field, gilding the fallen banners and the still air. A new dawn was rising over England, quiet, uncertain, yet filled with promise. The first age of the Plantagenets had ended. The Tudor dynasty had begun. When the last echo of steel faded across the field, Bosworth fell into a silence that felt almost sacred. The cries of battle were gone, replaced by the rustle of the wind through trampled grass and the distant call of crows circling in the pale sky. The sun, which had hidden for most of the morning, now broke through the thinning clouds, casting a wan golden light over the field where two eras had met. And one had ended. Among the still forms and broken banners, a small group of soldiers moved slowly, reverently. They were searching not for victory, but for closure. It was then that they found Richard III, the last king of the Plantagenet line, lying where he had made his final stand. His armor was dented, his crown lost, but his expression, witnesses would later say, was one of defiance, frozen between fury and peace. The men lifted him with quiet care. There was no triumph in their gestures, no mockery, for even in defeat, a king remained a king. They placed his body on a makeshift cart and began the solemn procession back through the field, past soldiers who turned their heads in silence. No one cheered, no one spat. History itself seemed to pause, bowing its head to mark the passing of an age. As the cart rolled away, Henry Tudor stood watching, his eyes steady. Around him, the remnants of two armies, Yorkist and Lancastrian alike, waited, uncertain what to feel. For decades, they had fought for colors, crowns, and causes that had left the land weary and divided. Now, in the stillness, there was only one truth left. The war was over. Lord Stanley approached, bowing his head. "Your Grace," he said, "England is yours." Henry said nothing at first. He looked across the vast field, at the smoke drifting upward, and the banners fallen to mud. "No," he replied at last, his voice low. "England is ours." It was not a declaration of ownership, but of unity. And in that single sentence, the tone of the new reign was set. The men around him dropped to one knee. Voices rose, hesitant at first, then growing stronger as they began to chant, "God save King Henry, God save Henry VII." The words rolled across the plain like a prayer, carried by wind and relief. Henry did not smile, but the weight in his eyes shifted. The burden of exile had lifted. The long shadow of the roses had begun to fade. By dusk, the field had been cleared, and the once divided soldiers set to work together, tending to the wounded and gathering the fallen. No banners of triumph were raised, no songs of conquest sung. The men seemed to understand instinctively that this was not an ending to be celebrated, but a reckoning to be remembered. In the small hours of that night, Henry walked alone beyond the camp, where the fog once again crept low over the earth. He knelt on the damp soil and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for peace. He thought of his mother, Margaret Beaufort, whose faith had carried him through years of exile, of Elizabeth of York, waiting somewhere across the sea, unaware that their union would soon bind two bleeding halves of England into one. He rose as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. A new day, a new kingdom. Within weeks, the news spread through England like wind through the trees. The Plantagenets were no more. The dynasty that had ruled for over 3 centuries, born of conquest, expanded through glory, and destroyed by civil war, had fallen silent. In its place, a new name began to take hold in the hearts of the weary, Tudor. Henry's coronation took place that autumn in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was grand but solemn, as if the nation itself were holding its breath. The archbishop placed the crown upon his head, and the people cheered. But beneath the ceremony lay something deeper, a collective sigh of relief. The wars that had torn England apart were over, yet Henry understood that peace was not something declared, it had to be built. His first act as king was not vengeance but reconciliation. He confirmed the titles of many Yorkist lords who had fought against him. He called for mercy rather than retribution, and, most importantly, he pledged to unite the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York through his marriage to Elizabeth of York. That union would give birth to one of England's most enduring symbols, the Tudor Rose. It was a simple emblem, a red and white rose joined together, but its meaning ran deep. The red petals spoke of sacrifice and struggle, the white of peace and renewal. Together, they formed a single bloom that told the story of a nation learning to heal. Artists and poets of the new reign embraced it. The Tudor Rose appeared on banners, coins, stained glass, and royal seals. It became not merely the badge of a dynasty, but the emblem of hope, proof that even after decades of conflict, England could be reborn from within itself. For Henry, it was more than symbol. It was destiny fulfilled. He ruled with cautious wisdom, aware that unity was fragile and that peace demanded constant tending. He surrounded himself with counselors of both factions, encouraged trade, restored faith in law and order, and began the long work of rebuilding a realm exhausted by war. Yet he never forgot the field where it had all begun. In private, he often spoke of Bosworth not as victory, but as deliverance. "It was not the sword that won the crown," he once said quietly to his mother, "but the will to end the sorrow." And so, the Wars of the Roses closed, not with triumphal fanfare, but with a whisper of reconciliation. The Plantagenets passed into history, their story one of glory and ruin. The Tudors rose from their ashes, carrying the promise of a different kind of rule, one born not from conquest, but from endurance. As the years went by, the memory of Bosworth softened. The land healed, harvests returned, and England, for the first time in generations, began to dream of a future not defined by war. In the quiet of Westminster, beneath vaulted stone and candlelight, the crown that had once slipped from Richard's head now rested securely upon Henry's. And on the royal seal beside it bloomed the Tudor rose, half red, half white, its petals intertwined, forever reminding England of the day when blood and peace became one, when the cheers from Bosworth had faded into history and the smoke of war dissolved into England's restless sky. A new kind of silence settled over the realm, one not of defeat or mourning, but of weary anticipation. For the first time in decades, the throne stood undisputed, and upon it sat a man who understood, perhaps better than any king before him, that crowns were not won in battle. They were built in peace. Henry VII began his reign not with spectacle, but with calculation. He had seen too much of chaos to mistake glory for stability. England was bruised, its fields scarred by years of strife, its coffers nearly empty, its nobles swollen with private power. The new king's task was not to conquer, but to heal. Yet healing, as he knew, required discipline as much as mercy. His first acts as monarch revealed a mind both cautious and visionary. He moved swiftly to restore royal authority, knowing that the wars had left the crown little more than a symbol. Through patient reform, he began to reforge its strength. He reduced the privileges of the great nobles, those families who had once raised private armies and turned battlefields into playgrounds of ambition. No longer would England's fate be dictated by lords who fancied themselves kings in miniature. Henry tightened the reins of taxation, reasserted the law of the crown, and demanded that every noble swear loyalty not merely to his person, but to the realm itself. He required bonds, legal pledges of good behavior that effectively bound the aristocracy in webs of accountability. Some whispered that he ruled through fear, but Henry knew better. Fear passes, order endures. His greatest institutional creation was the Star Chamber, a royal court where justice was to be delivered not by hereditary privilege, but by the impartial will of the king. Beneath its gilded ceiling, corruption met consequence. It became the instrument through which Henry balanced mercy with control, a symbol of a new England where law, not lineage, defined authority. The treasury, once drained by war and noble excess, slowly began to recover. Henry was methodical, even frugal. He sought revenues through trade, taxation, and careful diplomacy rather than conquest. The ports of London and Bristol began to hum with commerce once more. Merchants found safety in the roads, and ships sailed under the promise of royal stability. In the markets, people spoke of the king not as a warrior, but as a keeper of order, a man whose very restraint was a form of strength. Yet Henry understood that peace alone would not mend the fractures of a kingdom still divided by memory. To unite England's heart, he needed more than laws. He needed symbols. And so he turned to marriage. In January 1486, he wed Elizabeth of York, daughter of the late King Edward IV. The union was more than a royal alliance. It was the embodiment of reconciliation. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, once emblems of hatred, now intertwined as one, the Tudor rose. Their wedding was modest, yet its meaning profound. Chroniclers described the moment when the royal banners were unfurled together, the red and white merging under candlelight, as if the nation itself exhaled. For the weary people of England, it was not simply a marriage between two individuals, but between two legacies that had for too long stood opposed. The court poets called it the wedding of peace and destiny. Elizabeth became queen not by conquest, but by grace. Gentle and dignified, she brought the aura of Yorkist legitimacy to the Tudor throne, soothing old wounds that no sword could have healed. Her presence softened Henry's stern image. Together, they represented balance, his caution and her warmth, his discipline and her compassion. To their subjects, they appeared as the living embodiment of the England they longed to see, whole again. The years that followed saw slow but unmistakable transformation. The crown, once the plaything of factions, began to command respect again. The nobility, stripped of unchecked power, learned to serve rather than scheme. The merchant class grew in wealth and influence, finding in Henry's steady hand the promise of predictability. The church, though still vast and powerful, now bowed subtly to the authority of the state. Even abroad, England's image began to shift. Foreign courts that had once dismissed the island as unstable now spoke of its prudence. Treaties replaced invasions. Trade replaced tribute. Henry forged alliances not through battle, but through marriage, betrothing his eldest son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, and later securing ties that would echo across Europe. But beneath the calm surface, Henry never forgot the precariousness of peace. He had lived too long in exile, too often under threat, to take loyalty for granted. His court was one of quiet observation. Letters were read, rumors followed, secrets weighed. He trusted few, perhaps because he trusted history even less. Yet, paradoxically, this vigilance became the foundation of stability. He governed not through spectacle or cruelty, but through patience and design, the invisible architecture of endurance. By the turn of the century, England had begun to resemble something it had not been in generations. A nation reborn. Roads once deserted were busy again. The royal standard fluttered over fields no longer soaked with strife, but planted with harvest. In the halls of Westminster, records replaced war banners. In towns and ports, prosperity whispered of renewal. For the first time in 100 years, children were born into a land that did not expect war. And in the great hall of the palace, beneath painted ceilings that shimmered with new light, the royal seal of Henry VII bore the Tudor rose, red and white entwined. Beneath it was engraved a single phrase, England reborn. It was not triumph, but resolution, the quiet promise of a king who understood that nations are not remade by swords, but by steady hands and steadfast hearts. Thus began the Tudor age, not with the roar of conquest, but with the whisper of reconciliation, an era where the lessons of war became the architecture of peace. The years that followed Henry VII's coronation did not glitter with the pageantry of conquest, but with the quieter light of renewal. In the steadiness of his reign, England began to breathe again, a kingdom not of kings and battles, but of laws, order, and rebuilding. The throne, once a symbol of division, was becoming the spine of a nation rediscovering its strength. The war-scarred countryside slowly healed. Roads long abandoned to bandits were patrolled again. The silver coin bearing the Tudor rose passed from hand to hand, carrying not only value, but reassurance. In every town, markets reopened, and cathedrals began to hum once more with the voices of choirs rather than the echoes of lament. The people had grown tired of glory. What they desired now was stability. Henry understood this perfectly. He was not the kind of monarch who sought admiration through spectacle. His court was quiet, his decisions deliberate, his reforms subtle but enduring. Through careful planning, he built what future generations would call the English Renaissance. Not through art or poetry at first, but through structure, justice, and reason. Henry's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the council chamber. He surrounded himself with minds sharper than swords, men of intellect rather than inheritance. Among them was John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury, a pragmatic statesman whose balance of moral gravity and political skill helped anchor the new order. Morton became the architect of Henry's policies, guiding the crown toward fairness and accountability while keeping the nobility in check. And from Morton's mentorship would rise another figure, young and brilliant, Thomas More. Still a student then, More embodied the generation that the New England would nurture, disciplined, humanist, and deeply moral. He would later write of justice, conscience, and an ideal state, ideas that began as whispers in Henry's early reign, when the notion of an England governed by reason first took root. But if Morton and Moray represented intellect and reform, the unseen heart of the Tudor Restoration was still Margaret Beaufort, the king's mother. Her piety was the moral compass of the court. Her influence, though soft-spoken, was immense. It was she who founded colleges at Cambridge, believing that knowledge was the true fortress of faith and stability. While others forged swords, she forged minds. Henry revered her with near religious devotion. To him, she was not merely his mother, but the conscience of the crown. Together, these figures formed the quiet trinity of the early Tudor age: the king, the thinker, and the saint. Through them, England began to transform from a fractured realm into an ordered society. Henry's approach to rule was less about glory than about permanence. He rebuilt the machinery of government that civil war had shattered. The exchequer was restored, the courts restructured, the council reorganized into an efficient body of loyal administrators. For the first time in generations, justice flowed downward rather than sideways. Not a favor to be bought, but a right to be respected. His laws were practical, not poetic. He punished corruption, restrained the arrogance of nobles, and rewarded diligence over birth. Where the Plantagenets had ruled by passion and power, the Tudors ruled by design. Henry turned kingship into a craft, an art of patience, foresight, and restraint. It was this invisible labor that laid the foundations for what would become the English Renaissance. Under Henry, education was encouraged. The printing press flourished. Trade brought ideas as much as goods. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge became hothouses of inquiry. Scholars studied not only scripture, but the philosophy of Greece and the reason of Rome. Latin manuscripts were copied beside English chronicles, and for the first time, England began to look both backward and forward at once, to remember and to reinvent. This shift was more than intellectual, it was spiritual. The nation that had been divided by lineage now began to find unity in learning and law. The divine right of kings gave way, little by little, to the divine duty of governance. The king was no longer seen as God's chosen warrior, but as God's steward of justice. In this, Henry's reign became something larger than himself. He was not a charismatic hero, nor a visionary dreamer, but a craftsman of stability, a monarch who understood that lasting power is quiet power. While Europe danced to the drumbeat of conquest and empire, England cultivated patience, discipline, and self-awareness. In time, even those who had doubted the Tudors began to see what had taken shape. Not a restoration of the old order, but the birth of a new one. Chroniclers would later write of this era with awe, calling it the mending of England's soul. From the ruins of feudal pride rose a kingdom that valued balance over bloodline, reason over rage. The courts, the treasury, the universities, and the church each began to find its place in the great machinery of national rebirth. And amid it all, the Tudor rose flourished, painted on walls, stamped on coins, carved into stone. It was more than a royal emblem now. It was a promise. Red for courage, white for peace, joined at the stem by endurance. Every petal told the same story, that from ruin, something gentler could grow. By the final years of Henry's reign, England had become what few had dared imagine after so much turmoil, a land at ease with itself. Trade was steady, justice predictable, the treasury full. The people no longer spoke in the language of war, but of progress. And yet, even in success, Henry remained watchful. He knew that peace was not a gift to be received, but a garden to be tended. His legacy would not be the splendor of kings, but the stability of a nation reborn. In the chronicles of time, historians would later write, "From the wreck of the old empire rose a new order, the Tudor age, forged not in conquest, but in conscience." And so it was that from the ashes of the Plantagenets, through prudence, intellect, and faith, England emerged renewed, no longer a kingdom at war with itself, but a realm preparing to lead the modern world. From the ruins of the old world, one scholar would later write, arose not silence, but harmony, the dawn of Tudor England. In the closing years of the 15th century, England stood upon the threshold of something quietly extraordinary. The noise of centuries of conquest, rebellion, and rivalry had finally faded into memory. In its place rose a steadier rhythm, one not of war but of identity. The age of bloodlines was giving way to the age of symbols. Under Henry VII, the kingdom no longer drew its strength from the sword, but from the story it chose to tell about itself. At the heart of that story bloomed a single image, simple yet profound, the Tudor rose. It appeared everywhere, carved into church stone, painted on the walls of Westminster, stamped upon silver coins and royal seals. Red within white, the two colors intertwined. It became a language of reconciliation. Where once families had fought under separate banners, now all England rallied under one emblem, a rose that belonged to no faction, but to the realm itself. To Henry, this was not mere decoration. It was a declaration. The Tudor rose embodied what his crown stood for: unity after division, peace after chaos, order after storm. Every petal whispered the same message, that England's destiny was not written by blood alone, but by the will to endure. This idea marked a profound transformation in how monarchy was understood. The Plantagenets had ruled by the authority of ancestry, their legitimacy drawn from the endless branching of family trees. The Tudors, by contrast, ruled through myth and meaning. Henry's right to the throne, once fragile, became unassailable not by genealogy, but by the story his reign told, a story of healing, renewal, and divine favor reborn. Through this new lens, the crown itself changed. It ceased to be the prize of warriors and became instead the symbol of the nation. Its power no longer rested solely on descent, but on its moral right to govern, on justice, mercy, and the idea that the king existed not above the people, but within their story. Henry understood the artistry of monarchy as few before him had. He mastered the quiet theater of power, the way light caught a crown during a ceremony, the balance between humility and command. Every procession, every public act was choreographed not for grandeur but for meaning. He wanted his subjects to see the crown not as an ornament, but as a mirror, reflecting their hope for a future unmarred by the violence of the past. And so, under his reign, the image of the monarch began to evolve. No longer a feudal warlord in armor, the king became a guardian of peace, robed in restraint. Portraits of Henry show not the vigor of youth, but the gravity of stability, the calm of a man who carries history rather than conquers it. Behind him, always, the Tudor rose glows softly, as though it breathes life into the realm itself. This marriage between image and ideal became the cornerstone of the New England, a country learning to define itself through symbols rather than swords. Even architecture echoed this philosophy. Palaces rose not as fortresses, but as open courts of justice. Churches gleamed with stained glass depicting saints, kings, and roses, all woven into a single divine pattern. The visual poetry of the Tudor world gave England something it had never truly possessed before: a shared identity. The effect was profound. The Tudor rose became more than an emblem. It became a theology of nationhood. It told a people who had been torn apart that they could belong to something greater than lineage or allegiance. In that single image, Henry turned politics into faith. It is easy to imagine in cinematic reverie how this transformation might have felt to those who witnessed it. The year is 1487. Westminster Abbey is shrouded in incense and candlelight. Nobles, clergy, and commoners fill the great nave, their faces lifted toward the sanctuary where the coronation of Henry VII is about to take place once more, this time not in triumph, but in ceremony, the ritual sealing of a new world. The archbishop steps forward, the crown gleaming on a silk cushion. As the choir swells, Henry kneels. The murmured prayers blend with the echo of organ pipes that tremble like distant thunder. And then, in a single motion, the crown is lowered upon his head. The light strikes gold. It spills across the jewels, the polished floor, the watching faces. And, for a fleeting moment, time seems to stop. In that glimmering reflection, crown, rose, and king, England sees itself reborn. The camera of history would linger there, on the crown catching the light of stained glass, on the rose carved into the throne's armrest, on the king's face turned upward as the choir reaches its final note. Slowly the image would rise, past the crown, past the vaulted ceiling, past the spires and clouds, until the kingdom itself lies beneath, bathed in dawn. A new light for a new age. The narrator's voice, if one could imagine. It would speak softly, not as judgment, but as remembrance. The empire of the Plantagenets has fallen, yet from its ashes England found not loss, but itself. The Tudor rose fades onto the screen, red within white, the eternal symbol of reconciliation, and with that, the story closes, not on the clang of steel, but on the harmony of endurance. The wars are over, the crown endures, and in that endurance a nation is born anew. For though empires crumble and dynasties fade, there are moments when history itself seems to pause, when from the ruins of ambition, a people rediscovers its soul. That was the gift of Henry VII's England. Not conquest, not glory, but the simple enduring truth that from the wreckage of the old world, something lasting and beautiful can still be made. For nearly 400 years, the name Plantagenet had stood at the heart of England's story, a dynasty born in conquest, hardened by ambition, and undone by the very forces it had set in motion. It began with Henry II, a king of immense intellect and iron discipline, who sought to tame the chaos of feudal rule with a system of justice that would outlive him. He built courts and laws shaping the principle that even the crown was bound by the rule of law. Under his hand, England began to move from tribal fealty to ordered governance. Yet the same intensity that built his empire also fractured it. His sons, driven by the same fiery pride that defined their father, turned their swords against one another. The dream of unity became a struggle for inheritance, and the seeds of future conflict were quietly sown. Richard the Lionheart carried the Plantagenet banner across the seas, a knightly figure whose courage became legend. He embodied the ideal of the medieval warrior king, but his greatness abroad left his kingdom vulnerable at home. He spent his reign in crusade and captivity, and in his absence, the authority of the crown waned. His brother John, inheriting a throne stripped of loyalty, ruled through fear and greed. When the barons rose against him, they forced his trembling hand to sign a document that would echo through the ages, the Magna Carta, the first acknowledgement that power must be accountable. In that moment of rebellion, a paradox was born. A monarchy limited by law, an empire bound by conscience. Then came Edward I, fierce and visionary, who sought to weld the kingdoms of Britain under one rule. He brought Wales to heel, dreamed of Scotland subdued, and gave England a new sense of imperial purpose. His reign was both brutal and brilliant, a fusion of law and conquest. His grandson, Edward III, carried that legacy further still, waging the 100 Years' War and leading England to the heights of medieval glory. Chivalry, order, and national pride reached their peak. Yet even as banners fluttered over French soil, the old fragility remained. Victory bred arrogance. Wealth turned to corruption. From the splendor of Edward's court would rise the long shadow of decline. Richard II, born into luxury, believed his crown divine. He saw himself as God's anointed, untouchable, ordained to rule by celestial right. But pride isolates even the chosen. His court glittered with ceremony, but behind the pageantry, resentment simmered. When the nobles rose against him, he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the first king of the House of Lancaster. In that moment, the Plantagenet house split in two, and the Wars of the Roses began their slow, inevitable descent. Henry IV ruled with caution, haunted by the knowledge that usurpers must always look over their shoulders. His son Henry V seemed to redeem it all. The warrior king of Agincourt, uniting his people in one last blaze of glory. Yet his triumph was short-lived. He died young, leaving an infant son to bear a crown far too heavy for his years. Under Henry VI, the fragile kingdom began to crack again. Madness in the court, rebellion in the fields, and ambition among the nobles reopened the wounds of civil war. York and Lancaster, red and white, two branches of the same ancient tree, now turned their roots against each other England was torn apart, not by foreign enemies, but by its own reflection. By the time Richard III seized the throne, the Plantagenet name was worn thin, its majesty hollowed by decades of strife. He was fierce, determined, perhaps even sincere in his desire to bring stability, but history had grown tired of kings who spoke of order while the world burned around them. When he fell at Bosworth Field, struck down in his final charge, it was not just a king who died, but the idea of the medieval world itself. The Plantagenets, who had given England its laws, its language of kingship, and its sense of destiny, had been undone by the very ambition that had once made them great. They had built a kingdom so strong that even their own fall could not destroy it. From their ruin, England would rise again. Henry Tudor's victory in 1485 marked more than a change of rulers. It marked the birth of a new idea, that a nation could define itself not by lineage, but by purpose. Where the Plantagenets had ruled by blood, the Tudors would rule by symbol. Henry VII, cautious and deliberate, understood that England's survival depended on healing, not conquest. His crown was not forged in war, but in compromise. His emblem, the Tudor rose, was a deliberate act of creation, the red of Lancaster and the white of York entwined in perfect symmetry. Through that image, he offered his people not domination, but reconciliation. He rebuilt the monarchy from its ashes, not as a divine inheritance, but as a contract between ruler and realm. His quiet strength laid the foundation for the England that would follow. Henry VIII, his son, transformed the very notion of sovereignty, breaking from Rome and placing the crown above the church. It was not merely an act of defiance, but a declaration that England would govern itself, spiritually, politically, and morally. The English Reformation, turbulent though it was, became a defining moment of independence. For the first time, the realm saw itself as a nation apart, with a destiny written in its own hand. From that upheaval rose Elizabeth I, the daughter who would complete the work of her forefathers. Her reign turned the Tudor experiment into legend. Under her, England found confidence, a balance of intellect and strength, restraint and imagination. The arts flourished. Exploration stretched the boundaries of the known world, and the idea of England transformed from a patchwork of loyalties into a shared vision of identity. If Henry II had given England law, and Edward III had given it glory, Elizabeth gave it soul. The feudal past had given way to a modern nation. The Tudors ruled not by claiming descent from heaven, but by mastering the art of meaning. The Plantagenets had believed power flowed from blood. The Tudors taught that power flowed from belief. Their legacy was not in their armies, but in their symbols: the crown, the rose, the image of unity and continuity. The crown itself ceased to be a possession and became a promise that kings would serve not just God, but the people, that England's destiny would be shaped not by bloodline, but by character. And yet, beneath the stability and splendor, the Tudors understood what the Plantagenets had learned too late, that all power is temporary. Each generation must earn the right to rule anew. Henry VII earned it through restraint, Henry VIII through audacity, and Elizabeth through wisdom. Together, they taught England a lesson that would outlive them all, that the nation's true strength lay not in its kings, but in its capacity to endure. Looking back across the centuries, one can trace the arc of English history like a long breath between two worlds, the medieval and the modern, the feudal and the national. The Plantagenets had built the structure, the Tudors gave it life. The old empire of knights and lords dissolved into a state of laws, learning, and purpose. From the chaos of succession and the ruin of civil war emerged the foundations of the modern age: parliament, commerce, education, and the belief that a people could define their own destiny. Power, of course, never ceases to turn its wheel. Every crown contains the seed of its own undoing. But in that endless rotation lies the rhythm of civilization. The Plantagenets rose through conquest and fell through pride. The Tudors rose through reconciliation and survived through caution. Between them lies the eternal truth of monarchy, that it endures not through blood, but through renewal. If one were to walk today through the great halls of Westminster or the cloisters of Canterbury, the echoes of both houses still linger. The stones remember the ambitions of kings, and the prayers of common men. The rose, red and white, still blooms carved into marble. Reminder that peace is not born from perfection, but from the will to begin again. And so, history closes the circle. The Plantagenet age gave England its body, its law, its courage, its restless ambition. The Tudor age gave it its mind, its faith in order, its vision of unity, its sense of purpose. Together, they shaped the nation that would one day stand at the heart of the modern world. No dynasty lasts forever. No crown is truly permanent. Every empire fades. Every monarch falls. But within their rise and fall lies the story of humanity itself, our struggle to balance power with conscience, ambition with wisdom, inheritance with renewal. From Plantagenet to Tudor, from chaos to order, from lineage to nation, England learned a truth greater than any crown could symbolize, that the throne is not inherited, it is earned, and sometimes, in the quiet aftermath of ruin, it is reborn. As centuries pass and new ages dawn, the lesson remains unchanged. Kingdoms are built and broken, but what endures is the spirit that rebuilds them. The empires of men may crumble, but the idea of England, patient, enduring, reborn through every fall, continues. And if history could speak one last time, its voice would be calm, like the tide upon a distant shore, whispering across the ages. Empires fall, dynasties fade, but from the ashes of ambition, a nation always finds its soul again.